Hello and welcome to Grace tutorial. In this video lecture, we will be discussing about one of the most significant chapters of geography, that is the first chapter, resources and development. First of all, let us try to understand what does the term resources refer to. Well, everything in the environment that can be used to satisfy our needs, which can be technologically accessible, economically feasible, and culturally acceptable, are termed as the resource. Well, basically means human beings are the resources themselves. What do? They transform the materials which is available in the nature into the various viable resources, economically viable resources, with the help of technology and the various institutions or the structures. If you look at the types of the resources are broadly categorized into two types. One is the natural resource and number two, the human resources. And this natural resource have been further categorized into two types. One is the renewable resources and number two, the non-renewable resources. These renewable resources have been further divided into two categories. One is the flow or continuous and number two, the biological resources. Similarly, the non-renewable resources have been again divided into two types. Those are recyclable as well as the non-recyclable resources. These biological resources further divided into two forms. Those are natural vegetation and the wildlife. Similarly, these human resources have been divided into two types, structures and institutions, the quality and quantity. Here, we will discuss one by one in a very brief manner. First of all, let us try to understand what do you mean by the natural resources. Well, the resources which are obtained from the nature are called the natural resources. The natural resources are classified into the various forms on the basis of some factors. Let us try to understand that on the basis of what factors, and on the basis of those factors the resources are classified into how many types. We'll see. On the basis of origin. Well, on the basis of origin, the natural resources are classified into two categories. One is the biotic and number two, the abiotic. That means on the basis of the origin, the natural resources are classified into the biotic natural resources as well as the abiotic natural resources. Now we need to understand that what do you mean by this biotic natural resources? The resources which are obtained from the biospheres. Well, the resources which are obtained from the biospheres are known as the biotic resources. Those are human beings, livestock, flora and fauna, etc. These are the resources obtained from the biospheres. That's why it comes under the biotic resources. Similarly, what do you mean by these abiotic resources? The resources which are composed of the non-living things such as soil, metals, winds, etc. So the resources which are composed of the non-living things are called the abiotic resources. For example, soil, metals, winds, etc. That means it is very clear to understand that on the basis of the origin, the natural resources have been categorized into two types. One is the biotic resource and number two, the abiotic resource. The biotic resources are those resources which are obtained from the biospheres. You know, the coal and petroleum may also be considered as the biotic resources. Why? Because they may be obtained from, they are formed by the decaying of the life forms. So the abiotic resources are those resources which are formed by the decaying of the life forms. For example, Now, the abiotic resources are those resources which is composed of the non-living things. For example, soil, metals, winds, etc. All these are the abiotic resources which are obtained from the non-living things. And we'll move on to number 2. That is, on the basis of exhaustibility and the limitation of use. So on the basis of exhaustibility and the limitation of use, the resources have been categorized into the various types. So what are those? Those are renewable resources and non-renewable resources. That means on the basis of their exhaustibility and the limitation of the use, the natural resources have been categorized into the renewable resources as well as the non-renewable resources. So which resources are basically called the renewable resources? The resources which can be renewed, replenished or reproduced are known as the renewable resources. But those resources can be reproduced, renewed and replenished by the physical, chemical and the mechanical processes. So what are the resources come under this renewable resources? Solar energy, wind energy, water, etc. Well, the solar energy, wind energy, water, etc. come under the renewable resources, and these resources can be replenished or reproduced, or it can be renewed. That's why these resources are called the renewable resources. These renewable resources have been further categorized into two forms. One is the flow or continuous resources, and number 2, the biological resources. So what do you mean by this flow or continuous resources? These are the resources which can be reproduced, which can be replenished, and it can be used at a time. And one more thing you need to remember, that these resources do not remain at a location. That means these resources do not remain in one place and it moves from one place to another due to its various physical environment. By the action of the physical environment, these resources do not remain in one place and it moves from one to another. It moves from one place to another. For example, the running water, winds, etc. The running water, winds are the resources which come under the flow or the continuous resources. Now let's discuss what do you mean by this biological resources. Well, the resources which are acquired by the organism for the growth, the maintenance and the reproduction are called the biological resources. These biological resources have been further subdivided into two forms. One is the natural vegetation, which talks about flora, and number 2, the wildlife, it talks about fauna. So the natural vegetation talks about flora and the wildlife talks about the fauna, and these resources come under the biological resources. It's very simple to understand, my dear students. The renewable resources have been further divided into two types. One is a flow or continuous resource and biological resource. So which resources are said as the flow or continuous resource? Those resources which do not remain at one place and it moves from one place to another by the action of the physical environment. And those resources like running water, winds, etc. come under the flow or continuous resources. Similarly, those resources which are acquired by the organism for the growth and maintenance and for the reproduction are called the biological resources. And it has been further subdivided into two types. One is natural vegetation, which talks about the flora, and number 2, the wildlife, which talks about the fauna. Similarly, on the basis of the exhaustibility and the limitation of the use, this natural resource also divided into one more type, that is non-renewable. So what do you mean by this non-renewable resources? The resources which cannot be renewed or which cannot be reproduced or which cannot be replenished are known as the non-renewable resources. Well, the non-renewable resources have been further divided into two types. One is the recyclable non-renewable resources and number two, the non-recyclable resources. So what do you mean by this recyclable resources? There are some resources which can be recycled. For example, the metals can be recycled by the application of the technology. But there are some resources which cannot be recycled. For example, the fossil fuels are the recycles. The fossil fuels are the resources which cannot be recycled. That's why the fossil fuels come under the non-recyclable resources and it get exhausted. Well, that's all about on the basis of exhaustibility and the limitation of the use. Next, if we talk that on the basis of ownership, the resources have been categorized into the various types. We'll discuss one by one. Well, on the basis of the ownership, the resources have been classified into individual resource, individual resources. Those resources which are owned privately by the individual is known as the individual resources. For example, pasture land, plantation, farmland, etc. These are the resources which are owned by the individual. That's why these resources are called the individual resources. And on the basis of the ownership, we have another resource, that is community owned resource. Community owned resource. So what do you mean by this community owned resource? The resources which are accessible to the entire members of the community are called the community owned resources. For example, pond water in the village, public parks, burial grounds, etc. The pond water in the village, public parks, burial grounds, all these are the resources which are accessible to the entire members of that community. That's why these resources come under the community owned resources. And we also have another type of the resources on the basis of ownership, that is national resources. So what do you mean by this national resources? The resources which are owned and controlled by the nation or the country are called the national resources. And the nation's government has the legal power to acquire even the private property for the welfare of the public. So national resources, for example, we have territorial sea, railway, canals, etc. So territorial sea, railways, canals, etc. These are the resources come under the national resources. Similarly, we have another type of the resource, that is international resources. International resources. What do you mean by this international resources? The resources which are regulated and controlled by the international institutions are called the international resources. For example, the open sea, which is used for the peaceful navigation. Similarly, the open sky, which is used for the flight movement. These are the resources which are controlled and regulated by the international institutions. That's why these resources come under the international resources. Well, that's all about the various types of resources on the basis of ownership. Let me give you a glance once more. On the basis of the ownership, the resources have been classified into the various categories. Those are individual resources. Those resources are said to be the individual resources which are owned and maintained by an individual. For example, the pasture land, plantation, farmlands, etc. Next, we have community owned resources. Those resources are said to be the community owned resources which is accessible to the entire members of that community. For example, the pond water in the village, the public parks, burial grounds, etc. Similarly, we have national resources. The resources which are controlled and owned by the nation or a country are called the national resources. The government has the legal power to protect, the government has the legal power to acquire even the property, even the private property, to protect, to safeguard, to give the safeguard to the public welfare. So the territorial sea, railways, canals, etc. These are the resources come under the national resources. Similarly, the international resources, the resources which are controlled and regulated by the international institutions are called the international resources. We have open sea, and these open sea are generally used for the peaceful navigation. Similarly, the open sky are used for the flight movement. So these are the resources come under the international resources. So this is what we have divided the various types of resources on the basis of the ownership. Now we will discuss on the basis of the status of development. The resources are divided into how many types? On the basis of status of development, the resources have been classified into various types. Number one, the potential resources. So what do you mean by this potential resources? Those resources are said to be the potential resources. Those resources are abundant in reason but have not been developed properly. So the resources which are found in abundance in the various regions but have not been developed properly are said to be the potential resources. For example, the solar and the wind energy in Rajasthan and the Gujarat, the tidal waves in the coasts of India, etc. are the resources come under the potential resources. Similarly, on the basis of the status of development, we have another type of the resources, that is developed resources. So what do you mean by this developed resources? These are the resources which are surveyed and quantified for the utilization with the help of technology. For example, the coal and the petroleum come under the developed resources. So the level of accessibility and the availability of the technology decides the development of the resources. Next, we have on the basis of this status of development, we have another type of the resources, that is stock. So what do you mean by the stock? These are the resources which are generally available in the various regions. These are available in the various forms, but we do not know the technology, we do not have the practical knowledge to use the resources. That means the resources are there, but we do not have the required knowledge to use them. Those resources are said to be the stock. For example, the hydrogen and oxygen are the rich source of energy which is present in the water, but we do not have the required technology to use them, and such resources are basically called the stock. And there are some resources in which the technology is available and the practical knowledge also can be used in order to use them, and those resources are called the reserves. But the fact is that the exploration is not started yet. So what's the difference between the stock and the resources? The stock are the resources. These are the resources. We have the resources, but we do not have the acquired knowledge, practical knowledge, technical knowledge to use those resources. But there are some of the resources which are available and we have the practical knowledge, but the exploration is not started yet. And those resources come under the reserves resources. For example, the forests. The forests are reserves and it has the limited explorations. Well, that's all about the status of the development of the resources. Let me give you a glance once more. On the basis of the status of the development of the resources, it has been categorized into various forms. Number one, the potential resource. Number two, the developed resource. And number three, the stock. And number four, the reserve resources. So this is all about the classification of the resources. So what did we discuss here? We discussed about the resource. What do you mean by the resource? And we discussed the various classification of the resources. That is, the resources have been classified into two types. One is the natural resource and number two, the human resources. The natural resources have been further divided into renewable as well as non-renewable. The renewable have been further subdivided into two forms, flow or continuous resource, and number two, biological. And this biological is divided into natural vegetation and wildlife. Similarly, the non-renewable is again divided into recyclable as well as the non-recyclable. Well, on the basis of the origin, the resources have been divided into the biotic as well as the abiotic, and on the basis of the exhaustibility of the rational exhaustibility and the limitation of the use, it is divided into renewable and non-renewable. In this way, we have been divided, or we have been classified the various forms of the resources. Well, that's all about the resources as well as its various classification, which you need to know about this. And in the next part of the lecture, I will be explaining you about the development of the resources as well as the resource planning in India. And if you would like to watch the next update notification, I would urge you and I request you to press the bell icon over here and subscribe to our YouTube channel for the latest notification. Thank you very much for watching.